Our study of the Kena Upanishad has moved to the next chapter. Sri Aurobindo titles his commentary here, The Parable of the Gods. This is the third chapter of the Kena, in which what has been prepared so far in the first two is now taken to a further development. but in a manner that is characteristic of the Vedic mind, and which to the modern mind is somewhat difficult to appreciate. Sri Aurobindo fills in the gaps. The difficulty of the modern mind is overcome in his commentary, which shows you in sequence the ideas and the experiences which the series of verses now describe. In this third chapter of the Kena, we summarized last time, there is the description of who have just won a great victory. They celebrate the victory as their own and do not recognize that it is the eternal. It is the growth of the eternal in the gods which is their greatness. And the eternal, knowing this, comes before them and they cannot recognize who he is. And so there is a great distress, and the gods try to understand what is this thing that they cannot recognize, which is obviously beyond their capacity. Their greatness is now insufficient. And they move forward to try to know. But among all the gods, the one whom they first put forward is Agni, because he is the one who knows all things. He is Jatavetas. He is born with all knowledge. He has the knowledge of all things born. It has double meaning. And so he is put forward to recognize who is this being before them, Yaksha. And Agni is unable to. He fails and returns. Then Vayu, who is able to embrace and contain all things, is asked now to embrace and contain and thus know. And he too fails. And finally Indra is put forward. And when Indra comes to recognize this being, it vanishes. But in that vast ether is not a blankness. Here he comes upon the woman, she who shines out in many forms, Uma, daughter of the snowy summits. And she reveals to him that this was the eternal, and it is the eternal's victory in which you grow in greatness. And then alone Indra came to know that this was the Brahman. Now this is the overall story in sum, skipping the details, some of which we touched last time. The sequence of the three deities put forward is very important, as we saw last time. They represent the three powers within us by which we may know the divine. And the parable itself is not just an allegorical story. It's not just a symbolism that we have to decode and convert into a thought understanding. It is intended to be the description of a living experience of what actually takes place in us, in our consciousness. The gods are not only cosmic powers, it is they who organize in us their working, which makes us capable of awakening in consciousness. It is their working in us which makes for the various powers of life, consciousness, knowledge, joy, beauty, strength. And all of these are their working that grows inside us, even as they operate still on a cosmic scale. They have a focal point in the individual. And so in this parable, what is being described is something which we are meant to dwell upon internally to recognize that movement within ourselves, and even through that recognition, bring forward these powers and turn them towards the divine. And in this sequence of the three coming forward one after the other is the preparation within us of our capacity to know and recognize the divine. And the last of them will be Indra. But the first of them is Agni. And we will see as we proceed how important this sequence is. And literally, it describes the stages of the sadhana. In the discussions in the first two chapters, the preparation for the sadhana has been made. We have been made to introspect, to recognize what is it that makes the mind fall to its mark, which drives our life energies, which makes our senses perceive, and so on. We have been made to recognize that there is a mind of our mind, life of our life, sense of our sense, and speech of our speech, which is the divine consciousness, which we have to know. But we cannot know it. This also we have recognized with our mind. And yet it is possible to make the mind still in such a way that it can reflect. And by this power of reflection, the divine consciousness can first begin to form in our mind, and our mind can have a first perception. And for that purpose, the Kena Upanishad taught us to begin by concentrating on that in us which is the Brahman, and that in the gods which is the Brahman. And in this, a preparation has been made of an introspection where we recognize that our own consciousness is essentially a part or a frontal projection of the divine consciousness. We are not separate from that. That of it which is thou. And observe what in you is one with that. And we come to this point of consciousness. And then that of it which is in the gods. And this is a perception turning outwards in the working of the universe. But then the two link when we recognize the same gods are working in us. And if the mind is turning to become conscious of the divine, to reflect and to know the divine, our mind is one of the gods. The light behind is indeed the greatest of the gods, Indra. And so the awakening of all the gods in us, we can, by the awakening of all the gods in us, we can grow to our highest potential until eventually we can know that. Because the working of that in the gods is what we are dwelling upon. And at this point, it is obvious that this is a means, a method by which our evolution can be greatly accelerated. When the working of the gods grows in us, we grow closer to that and can know that more easily. But there is a gap. There is a problem. When the working of the gods in us grows and becomes full, we can stop short and say, this is ours. The powers which have grown can stop short and think of themselves as having attained. They are the victorious. They are the ones who are complete. Using the power behind, mind of our mind, which in fact makes this move to its mark. And so the next description in this third chapter of the Kena is a dwelling within us of the workings of these divine powers. As they grow, as they are amplified, as they reach fullness, as we grow in capacity and mastery, we grow closer in our capacity to the eternal, but we make the error of stopping short because that's all that we can know. We can only know our own greatness. So now Sri Aurobindo explains, the Upanishad proceeds to develop this consequence of its central suggestion by a striking parable or apologue. The gods, the powers that affirm the good, the light, the joy and beauty, the strength and mastery, have found themselves victorious in their eternal battle with the powers that deny. Now, all of these things which have been listed are what the gods are pushing forward: the good, the light, the joy, the beauty, strength, mastery. You will see in these words the full forward movement of evolution is captured. Every forward step is an increase of these things. And obviously, when that happens, we feel wonderful, we feel great, we feel we have done it. It is Brahman that has stood behind the gods and conquered for them. The master of all, who guides all, has thrown his deciding will into the balance, put down his darkened children and exalted the children of light. And we discussed this last time, that the battle between the two is the means by which the forward movement of evolution takes place. Every time the powers of good, the gods, come to point out that this is not sufficient, they break that which is imperfect or incomplete, forcing the gods to move forward one more step, and then again the forward movement of the dark to oppose, and so on. In this way, by this double movement, evolution goes forward. And it is the master of all who is working through both. The negative side only points to the insufficiency of what is attained. The positive side points to the aim but can never reach it. And between these two are the steps moving forward. The dark mother and the bright mother who nourish together the human soul. And we now proceed from the text where we paused last time. In this victory of the master of all, the gods are conscious of a mighty development of themselves, a splendid efflorescence of their greatness in man. Their joy, their light, their glory, their power and pleasure. But their vision is as yet sealed to their own deeper truth. They know of themselves. They know not the eternal. They know the Godheads. They do not know God. Now, this description is connecting and elaborating on the first verse. In this description, Sri Aurobindo gives us the clue in our introspection. The gods are conscious of a mighty development of themselves. They are not conscious of the victory of the master. It's a development of themselves. And what is that? A splendid efflorescence. There is a complete flowering. The word efflorescence, flowering, is capturing the sense of the evolution and growth. All evolution begins with something which is a potential, like a bud. You look at the flower bud, it is not a flower. And yet you see in it the flower to come. In the bud is the full knowledge and strength to become the full flower. But it has not yet become it. In the bud, when the bud is barely formed, you do not see the petals, you do not have the perfume, you do not have the colors. And yet you can see that they are inevitable. And it is so in us, in our consciousness, deep within, in the essence of what we are. is the full potential of that flowering which is to be in our evolution. We do not yet see, we see only the first struggling layers beginning to emerge. But all the rest which has to come is still barely tentative in its form. Evolution is nothing but an unfolding, unraveling, flowering. But it is not a casual flowering, it is a splendid flowering. What comes out is a splendor of richness, of possibilities, far beyond anything we can conceive. And in this splendid efflorescence of their greatness in man, their joy, their light, their glory, their power and pleasure. Now, all of these things are part of the greatness to be unfolded. And straight away, the ascetic ideal is set aside. We do not look at spirituality as a barrenness. We do not look at evolution as a withdrawal. We see it as a fulfillment in life, in form of what? Joy, light, glory, power, pleasure. None of these are unspiritual. Their growth in us is meant to be, is intended, and their growth is meant to be completed in the full potential of these as exists already in the divine consciousness above. If we stop short and say this is all, then it would be a perversion. If we stop in a partial, unstable poise, we are pointing at a higher possibility, but not yet attempting to go beyond the limitation of where we are, then we suffer. If we crave the thing in itself, the forms in themselves, we suffer. But if we aim at the thing towards which these forms and these limited experiences point to, then we keep on moving forward, even though still limited in our capacity. So this full idea will develop as we proceed, but the recognition here is greatness, joy, light, glory, power, pleasure. All of these are part of the unfoldment and are intended to be a splendid efflorescence. And the gods are conscious of a mighty development of what? Of themselves. We have grown mighty, splendorous. We have grown in glory. Now this you will observe in yourself every time that you have some sense of growth or progress. The most obvious is in our growing years as children. And you observe what happens when a child struggles to overcome, let's say, an incapacity, training in something very mundane, a skill in gymnastics. He's struggling, not getting his balance. He's trying to lift, not strong enough, trying to climb, slipping, unable to hold. But then he puts a special intense effort. Observe what is happening there. There is within you first the power of Agni, an aspiration to do, to achieve, to realize, to become. Then the power of Vayu, the intensity of the energy flowing now to grasp, to hold and become one with what you're seeking. And then the turning of the full awareness in identification. And these are the three stages, Agni, Vayu and Indra, which we will see the same process now turned to realizing the Lord. But this is what's happening inside us. We turn, we seek, we struggle, and at some point there is a breakthrough. And I find I'm able to lift and I achieve. I'm able to hold my balance and I have the perfect harmony. I'm able to spin and complete perfectly. And when that comes, you see in the child the exaltation of the joy. I did it. He may not speak in so many words, but the glow of that. What is it in him that is so enthusiastic in the achievement? The very powers which turned to do, those powers are now glowing. My aspiration and the intensity of my will is exulting. The energies which I have poured into this effort are now glowing, radiating, and my full knowledge, consciousness turned in has now the certainty I can do. I am as good as any. I am greater than whatever form it may take. And this is the sense of the conscious of a mighty development in them of themselves. I have become more, greater. Except that our human experience reduces this to the I of the ego sense. I am more capable. Who is the I now? This surface ego center, which I think to be me, this bundle of habits and tendencies. But if you look deeply, the ego center itself is unstable, does not have a real core. It is vacuous, hollow. What is it that has grown? My life force, my willpower. Not I, this vague center that I call myself. It is the powers and faculties in me that have actually grown. It is the gods who have grown in their intensity and who are exulting, which the ego sense captures and centers around. I am so great. I could do what you others could not do. But when those powers withdraw, this I suddenly realizes I am incapable. It is this energy I had, this surge of power and capacity, which is what did it. And I call upon it. I turn in a remembrance, invocation, effort, and again those energies come forward. So this I who claims is only a surface, fickle appearance. The reality is these powers, which are the gods, which have grown in us. Behind that, though, the deeper reality is it is the master of all who has poured himself. So we reread the sentence. In this victory of the master of all, the gods are conscious of a mighty development of themselves, a splendid efflorescence of their greatness in man, their joy, their light, their glory, their power and pleasure. But their vision is as yet sealed to their own deeper truth. Now, this is the point. When these energies come forward and they grow in us, we feel this is all. After doing exercise, I feel my energies increased, my intelligence glowing, and it stops there. Not aware that behind there is a deeper truth. They know of themselves, they know not the eternal. They know the Godheads, they do not know the God. Why? Because their vision is as yet sealed to their own deeper truths. What is it that grew in me? I can only feel these energies and these intelligences and capacities and skills. I cannot feel what is behind. So the first verse of this chapter 3 from the Kena, Sri Aurobindo translates from the Sanskrit, the eternal conquered for the gods, and in the victory of the eternal, the gods grew to greatness. This was what they saw. Ours the victory, ours the greatness. So they know not the God, they know the Godhead, they do not know God. Therefore, they see the victory as their own, the greatness as their own. And you can see how this is a necessary first step in our evolution. When something is achieved, the energies, the powers, the capacities which have fulfilled must recognize their greatness and accept they are now capable. It helps them also to grow in their faith of their own capacity. This opulent efflorescence of the gods and uplifting of their greatness and light is the advance of man to his ordinary ideal of a perfectly enlightened mentality, a strong and sane vitality, a well-ordered body and senses, a harmonious, rich, active, and happy life. The Hellenic ideal, which the modern world holds to be our ultimate potentiality. What is this greatness that the gods have come to? Because the victory here is not one of the many smaller steps, it is one of the significant victories. And what is the significant victory in the human growth and evolution? This, which Sri Aurobindo describes at three levels of mind, life force, and the physical body. And as we will see, they represent again the three deities. The physical consciousness in the form and its victory is the domain of Agni's operation. The life energies within us is the domain of Vayu. And the mind's awakening is the domain of Indra. And it is these three in their completion which is the full ideal, which he describes as the Hellenic ideal. I will come to why he speaks of the Hellenic ideal here shortly. There's something very deep to be recognized there. So, looking at the text again, the opulent efflorescence of the gods and uplifting of their greatness and light is the advance of man to his ordinary ideal. These words, we have to pause on each of them because Sri Aurobindo does not waste words. And we ask why. He speaks of opulence, efflorescence, we have touched upon. But then he speaks here of uplifting of their greatness and light. What does it mean to have this uplifting? If you observe the inherent experience of evolution, there is a capacity. It is struggling, it is bound, it is limited, it is barely felt. It is as if lost in darkness, in lack of awareness. And then gradually this capacity emerges and you begin to feel it more and more in you. Ah, yes, perhaps I'm able to do this. And then it comes out into its own and takes an independent form until you can wield it independent of everything else. So observe, for example, in your childhood, your power of rational thinking was not developed. I still remember many times as a child, there were things which I saw and I understood, but I found there was no way to express. There was no way to put it in terms the way adults did. They said something, you knew it was wrong, but you could not express why you knew it was wrong or what was it that was wrong. The capacity to articulate or even to put in form and structure of logic was just not there. And yet the awareness of it was there. The awareness that this is wrong, the seeing of it as wrong was there, obvious. And then gradually this skill emerges. And you will see children as they hit teenage, they start picking on little words, little arguments, and they love to play it out and prove you wrong, especially to the parents who have so far been telling them what is right and wrong. They will now spin it around and argue back the very things you spoke and have a great joy in the victory of having defeated you with logic. And then that grows in capacity. At first, it is much more sensory. It is arguments around circumstances, and then it moves to arguments around ideas. And if the development is taken to its peak, the mind is so refined in its power of knowledge and handling knowledge that it now begins to live independently of the physical and sensory life. In my thoughts now, I can have a complete discussion. There's no one else, it's just me. A complete discussion of various ideas and come to my own conclusions and be very happy with it, very content. And at this point, this has acquired its maximum capacity. So the whole movement is of a power which is as if first subdued, even covered up, and then emerges, becomes more free, more light, more aware, and rises into its own until it is now free from what it has emerged out of. So all evolution involves something coming out of dullness, darkness, inertia, and then coming into its own in awareness, and as if the sense of rising, growing, and being free. So the uplifting of their greatness and light is this movement of emergence. Now, what is the interesting thing is, when such a struggle is taking place from below, something from above can come in, grip what is emerging, and pull it up rapidly, assist the emergence. And it is this which was one of the means of the Vedic practice of yoga. You call into yourself the gods so that they who are already operating free in the cosmos may engage with the same powers of theirs working within you, which are still darkened and bound, and they may assist in the drawing out and in the liberating and the full free working. So this whole uplifting is taking place by the action of the eternal. It is He who is finally pulling, drawing out, and developing in us the workings of the gods. And the result is the advance of man to his ordinary ideal. And the ideal is now described on the three levels of a perfectly enlightened mentality. It's not enough for the mind to be enlightened, it must be in its enlightenment perfectly enlightened. And the vitality, it's not enough for the vitality to be strong. The brute is also strong. But the vitality must be placed under the influence and leadership of the liberated mind. And so the strong and sane vitality, and in the physical form, a well-ordered body and senses, and the combination of these three levels, a harmonious, rich, active, and happy life. So the body itself must be well ordered, meaning all the parts must be working in harmony with each other, all the senses to be fully organized and developed. And then these three, when they are integrated, this is another part of it. When they are integrated, you have a harmonious, rich, active, and happy life. Isn't this what we all want? And this is part of the spiritual evolution. The three parts must be, first of all, harmonized among themselves. And then they must be harmonized with their equivalents out around us, in people, in things, in circumstances. So the harmonizing is the first step. The harmonizing itself can be very simple, minimal. And you will see many people who have a simple life, very well organized, perfectly balanced, but not very complex or rich. From here comes the next step of making more rich, more complex, taking to its fullness. And then in full activity. It's not enough to have a rich capacity but unable to flow in complete dynamism. Life demands from you at times a full flow of power, a full enthusiastic engagement and involvement. That too has to develop in the activity, and the happiness throughout all of this. So these are the four facets he describes. And all of these completed together is the ideal which the modern world holds to be our ultimate potentiality. We cannot do more than this. This is all we want anyway. But then he makes this reference, the Hellenic ideal. He could have just said the modern world holds this to be our ultimate potentiality. But he throws in this word, the Hellenic ideal. And it's not merely a historical reference. Sri Aurobindo does not use waste words. The Hellenic ideal, when he says, it turns us to recognize what was it that was being attempted in that period, in the Hellenic period in Greece. Yes, all of these ideals were there. But what was the means of achieving them? Much of this is now lost in modern times. But when we go deeper into the habits, practices, and the texts of the early Greeks, we discover something quite extraordinary. And in that, we will see a close correspondence with the Vedic ideals and practices. But he could have just as well said Vedic. He does not. The difference between the Hellenic and the Vedic is important. The Hellenic ideal stopped short. The Vedic ideal went all the way through to the spiritual, to the highest. But in their initial forward movement, there is a similarity. And I'll just touch upon a few of these as an example so you get a sense of what was being done. The early Greeks, like the Vedic rishis, recognized the working of the gods in the cosmos and in themselves, recognized that this forward movement of the gods in us is the sense of our evolution. And as in the Vedic practice, they invoked the gods for this purpose. In their practices, in the plays, for example, they enacted the stories of the gods. But the people who played the roles of the gods had to prepare themselves spiritually to be able to express that role perfectly. And the perfection here meant completely erase your own sense of individuality, that you may be one with the God that you are meant to represent, that the God may actually descend and manifest through you. You become as if a medium, a transparent medium for the gods to take human form and play out their divine game up there, but here in human form and human affairs. For which purpose they went through, first of all, they were selected carefully. They went through a period of preparation, of purification, of fasting for 3 days as part of that purification, during which time they had to be in complete immersion in loving adoration to the gods, to the god, the deity that they had to embody. And then only they came together for the great drama. So the drama itself was not merely for human entertainment. Hey, you play this role, I play this role, we narrate a story, we had fun. It is literally a bridging of the divine world with the human, and a recreation on human levels of the spiritual or the domain of the gods and their play and their drama. If you look at the traditional and classical forms of Indian drama, theatre, it is the famous, one of the greatest works of theatre, Natya Shastra. It includes in the mastery required not just the ability to act perfectly, which demands a full mastery of your whole body and the power of expression of the body in all the parts. It demands equally the capacity to sing, the capacity to play an instrument, the internal psychological preparation, the full plasticity of your psychological instrument to be able to express all the 9 moods freely and transition from one to the other without gaps. And the entire preparation was to make you as plastic an instrument as possible. And all of the traditional classical stories which you find played out even today in the traditional settings are all stories of this kind, of the battle between the gods and the demons. Even if they take the form of the enaction of Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they're still display of cosmic powers who are represented in those human characters and which are to be now played out. And their victory, as you watch, you experience their victory in you. As you watch the play, you recognize each of those in yourself as powers and aspects of. And as you identify with the whole drama, it's taking place in you. And when finally the powers of good are victorious over the powers of darkness, within you there is this shift that takes place, and the good comes forward. And you leave from that performance with the conquest of the gods within you. You grow, you evolve spiritually and psychologically. So such was the nature of the play. In the Indian tradition, the goal was through this process to be able to touch the spiritual, the underlying oneness beyond the gods. In the Greek Hellenic ideal, it stopped short with the gods. This is the only major difference. There are the finer differences, but in terms of major differences, these are the two major differences. Sri Aurobindo has a fascinating text where he compares I forget the name of the Greek sage and the Indian sage, and he compares their quest to find the ultimate reality underlying. And he points out how the Greek sage comes through to recognition of the four underlying elements, whereas the Indian tradition goes through beyond the four into the fifth, the etheric principle, which is the unifying oneness underlying, which brings it all together and holds it together in oneness. That difference is precisely the difference here felt. And this Hellenic ideal, in the way it was embodied, left its imprint not only in that civilization but through it upon humanity, and particularly in the forms that emerged through that phase of the Greek development on the whole of Europe as it spread out through the Greeks and the Romans and so on, to form in a large part what is the ideals and values, the philosophies and the world perspectives of the modern European mind, which subsequent to colonization has been imprinted all over the world as the common modern ideal. So this is where the Hellenic ideal, which the modern world holds to be our ultimate potentiality. And yet behind this, there are the deeper traditions which still survive, which still hold their strong force, waiting to emerge to take this ideal to its next logical step. We could stop short with this, and you notice the very countries which have brought their people to prosperity, stability, and happiness with free, high quality education, comfortable lives, these very countries very quickly tend to degenerate into purposelessness, breakdown of the social structure through all kinds of vices, or even in certain extremes through the suicides. The highest rates of suicides are also in these same developed and comfortable countries. And you wonder why? Because having come to this point, the mind looks at what next and sees nothing. It has been taught that you are here by chance. Your appearance on earth is an accident of evolution of molecules falling into place. Your ideals of a greater perfection are dreams and fancies of your brain waves. And there is nothing else left. And when the spirit does not feel a higher call, it withers and falls. And at this point, the quest begins. What else is there? And so you see a large turning all over the world to yoga for some greater, deeper truth and ideal. But something in the form of the parable of the gods here, a story so complex but also so profound and rich, is too obviously reduced to physical human terms for the modern mind to understand, because it is unable to recognize their deeper truths, and first touches upon a more rational framework of philosophy. You will see in Europe, for example, Buddhism has a great attraction because it is rational and yet opens you to a higher spiritual quest. And so it becomes a first point of contact, a first entry, because the mind still needs something rational, and accepts the highest truth to be rational. But having come to that, when it feels the insufficiency of what the rational mind can show, because the fundamental causes of existence and purpose of existence are still left unanswered, it only offers you an escape out of suffering, but without explaining why suffering and why things are the way they are. At that point, the same mind turns to something further and deeper, more intuitive, more deeply felt and experienced, which also can be expressed rationally but goes beyond mere rationality. And that's when the first turn to Vedanta takes place. But a narrower Vedanta, which may turn to the world and look at it as an illusion, perhaps, not explaining why the illusion comes, until eventually through that it can pass to something still greater, which is a life affirming, life embracing, and life transforming spirituality. So we see in the human evolution itself necessarily such stages. Especially in the collective level, you can see this very obviously, and the necessity for it is obvious. But the first step of this is this, the Hellenic ideal, where the ordinary ideal of a perfectly enlightened mentality, a strong and sane vitality, a well-ordered body and senses, a harmonious, rich, active, and happy life is what we have to first achieve. There's a very interesting message that the mother gave, which is put up in the gymnasium in the ashram's playground. And the message goes something like this. I'll have to paraphrase. I used to know it by heart, but I don't able to recall now. But paraphrasing it, it goes something like this. The body must be helped to grow to become plastic, harmonious, well-developed and in its capacities and so on, so that when the time comes, it can be a fit instrument for the spirituality. I'm paraphrasing. But the idea is this, that there's a first phase of the development where you bring all this together and complete. If you have not done this and the spirituality descends into an unstable, half-formed, unbalanced or incomplete individual, how do you express it to be able to manifest a spiritual perfection? So some kind of a first physical perfection of life is necessary. A basic adhar, foundation, in which something far greater now can fill and take to its completion. And so this is what is first pointed to. And at this point within us, the powers which are so brought into their full awakening and harmonized in this Hellenic ideal, the gods feel that they have conquered. Theirs is the victory. In the text of the Cana, ours the victory, ours the greatness. And again, the Cana does not waste words. First the victory, then the greatness. The victory itself is a defeat of the opposing, limiting powers. But having achieved the victory, there is the efflorescence into greatness. When such an efflorescence takes place, whether in the individual or the kind, the gods in man grow luminous, strong, happy. They feel they have conquered the world and they proceed to divide it among themselves and enjoy it. So this is the next step. When the victory is completed, there is this enjoyment of the gods, the greatness which is now played out freely in that space of victory. And this can take place on two levels, in the individual or in the kind, in the species, or in a subgroup in between. And there, the gods grow luminous, strong, happy. In other words, before this victory is complete, before this greatness can be manifested, the gods are not luminous, they are darkened, they are covered in the inertia of tamas. And they are weak, they are unable to overcome the resistance, and so they are unhappy. Within us, these powers which are struggling to come forward do not yet have their full expression of light and strength and joy. When they have come forward now, and all of them have come forward equally, there is a harmonization. They feel they have conquered the world, and they proceed to divide it among themselves and enjoy it. Now, this is a very important stage, and we have to recognize what happens within us. Here, the intelligence has grown, it has come into its own. My vitality has grown, it has come into its own. My body is now healthy and strong, it can do whatever it wants. What happens next? My body powers demand their fulfillment. My vitality demands its fulfillment. My mind demands its fulfillment. So such a person now, and you can imagine this ideal human being who has grown into full capacity. Well, I must have my good food and enjoy it. And I must eat largely with good variety and diversity of colors and tastes and flavors. And that is how you will satisfy the body, or various other forms. My vitality must have the satisfaction of conquering challenges, owning large empires, of however small or large they are. The excitement, the thrill of bungee jumping and overcoming my fears and achieving to what I thought, what would you normally consider impossible, flying through the air, and all the vital expansiveness. And my mind will read the philosophies, argue out, enter into domains of new creation of ideas and inventions. And you can see how they are each their own domain, partitioned. None of these are serving the source as unified instruments for that. The spiritual perfection will be when the mind turns to manifest the divine knowledge, the life energy turns to manifest the divine power, the physical body itself turns to manifest the divine beauty, and the soul within to manifest the divine love. Such is the fourfold divine expression in us, intended. But they are each four facets of a single movement of the divine consciousness emerging. But this has not happened. The gods instead proceed to divide it among themselves and enjoy it. So you can see how very quickly these three could go in different directions, and other powers in us could go in different directions, each seeking their enjoyment and satisfaction, but in the process tearing apart perhaps the whole point of forming the individual. There is not the possibility of a single movement taking multiple facets. The missing element is the unifying power of which the gods are aspects and powers. The eternal, whom they do not know. They know the Godhead, they do not know God. Okay? They feel they have conquered the world and they proceed to divide it among themselves and enjoy it. And at this point, again, I will pause and reconnect this with the Hellenic ideal. You see what happens in the Greek mythology. And remember, the myth here, the mythological stories are deep truths, seen, experienced in human affairs. You will see how all of the Greek stories involve the gods fighting among themselves. They humans they have selected, then follow in the wake. They fight among themselves. They throw a challenge to human beings. The human beings align with one god, and therefore the others are jealous, and they come to punish. This whole complex interplay begins, which leads eventually to the downfall and the collapse of the ideal as well as the civilization. You go to Greece today, you speak to the common man, they have no idea of what the Greek civilization represented then, what it embodied. They are like any other European city anywhere in the world. That's it. The thing is gone, it's lost entirely. You go to their temples, you do not feel it anymore. There are spaces, though, you may still feel, but there is nothing living of those ideals. And perhaps that time is over. It has served its purpose. But that collapse from something which had achieved such a greatness and ideal was inevitable because the perfection reached was incomplete. The gods now begin to divide the world among themselves and enjoy it, and that leads to a fragmentation eventually. In the Vedic yoga, there was one more step. After the gods had been brought to their fullness, they had to be harmonized. After they've been harmonized, then you have to transcend them and go further beyond. So you take their help to grow closer, and at some point you leave them away aside and go beyond them. And that's when you attain to the oneness. And now through a harmonized play of their powers, the oneness manifests. So we recognize this distinction and the limitation of this. What happens then when such a thing is achieved in a limited way? Obviously, there has to be an intervention. But such is not the full intention of Brahman in the universe or in the creature. The greatness of the gods is his own victory and greatness. But it is only given in order that man may grow nearer to the point at which his faculties will be strong enough to go beyond themselves and realize the transcendent. So the faculties are meant to grow to this point from which they can go further. The mind, which is our means of knowledge, with all the powers that it has developed, of philosophy, of argument, of rationality, if it stops short, it cannot know what is true. It can argue unendingly and still not be sure. It must at some point submit to a deeper knowledge which comes with the higher intuition, where you know and then you use the logic to justify or express what you know. But the knowledge of logic cannot give you the experience and the certainty. So it has to turn to connect to that. But if this is not developed, your intuition is no more intuition. It is a reflection in an inferior consciousness, which is instinct. In instinct, the urge comes, but the knowledge is behind. You do not earthquake. But they didn't know there would be an earthquake. They just knew they had to run. And that's all. And so, unless the rational mind is developed, the power of knowledge itself, although of an inferior grade, unless that is developed, one cannot ascend to the true intuition, where knowledge emerges first, leading the impulse. And so from the lower instinctive working, there is a passage through the intellect and its development, but it should not stop short. The intellect must then turn and submit to something greater. And then the full intuition can develop and link all the way down and complete its action in us. So the point of these faculties is they should grow strong enough to go beyond themselves and realize the transcendent. Therefore, now, what does Brahman do? This being the situation, he must assist the next step. Therefore, Brahman manifests himself before the exultant gods in their well-ordered world and puts to them by his silence the heart-shaking and world-shaking question. If you are all, then what am I? For see, I am, and I am here. Though he manifests, he does not reveal himself, but is seen and felt by them as a vague and tremendous presence. The terrible beyond good and evil, for whom good and evil are instruments towards his final self-expression. So the gods here includes both the positive and the negative, and they're all terrified. What is this? We thought we have achieved everything, and what is this? We cannot even know what it is, and it is greater than us. And by his silence, he puts this question: if you are all, what am I? And that creates this disturbance among them. So that is verse 2 in the Cana's third chapter. The Eternal knew their thought and appeared before them, and they knew not what was this mighty daemon. And so they sent successively Agni, Vayu, and Indra to know this. And that is the passage in our consciousness. We have realized our greatness, we achieved this, and then suddenly we have a glimpse of something. We do not know what it is. We sense a greater reality. What is this? I thought I was complete in myself, and suddenly in front of its presence, I feel humble, I feel insufficient, I feel incapable. All my knowledge pales in the presence of this enormous thing that I cannot know, that I cannot give form to or give words to. Simply the presence shakes everything and breaks apart all that I thought I had. And so he says, puts to them by his silence the heart-shaking and world-shaking question. Not only for the heart and the individual, but in the whole cosmos, there is a shake-up in the action of the gods. Something greater that is yet unknown, and which puts in question everything else and exposes their insufficiency by its very presence. And so the next step will begin of a further evolution. So this last sentence, its full import and the deeper sense of it, we will continue next Sunday. For now, we can just dwell on these two verses. And after Sri Aurobindo's elaborate exposition, you will find how formulation of two verses, so much is contained. And we can meditate on it for a minute. Verse 1, the Eternal conquered for the gods, and in the victory of the Eternal, the gods grew to greatness. This was what they saw. Ours the victory, ours the greatness. Verse 2, the Eternal knew their thought and appeared before them, and they knew not what was this mighty daemon.